Morning, everyone. This is Carrol Henderson, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share some information with you about 50 years since I began working with the non-game wildlife program in Minnesota in 1974. And I'm going to take you through a story of what I thought would be rather fascinating for you to realize, that what we have seen during our lifetime is a national evolution of game management for harvested game species to include the creation and implementation of non-game wildlife conservation programs in Minnesota and beyond. And of course, pollinators are a very important part of that whole picture. I'm going to take you back in time a little bit here. This is the late 1940s. This is the farm where I grew up in central Iowa, near the town of Ziering. And there I am with my grandfather planting corn in 1951. The last year we had horses for horse farming and a 2-row planter. And then we had free-range chickens back then. Here I am watching over the chicken flock in 1952. And by the age of 5, I had already shown an interest in nature and wildlife with attempting to do my work on art for birds. Then a little fast forward again, 1963, I became more interested in insects, butterflies, and other creatures with a 4-H insect collection that went to the state fair. And my background educationally, I went to Iowa State, studied a major in botany, minors, or zoology, minors in botany and physics. And then at the University of Georgia, where my major was ecology, wildlife management, and also journalism. And then I also spent 2 semesters with the Organization for Tropical Studies at the University of Costa Rica. That was in 1969. So I had a rather broad education. And what I'd like to do today is to share with you 2 of my major projects that I undertook after I retired in 2018. My first effort was what I'm calling my conservation playbook or workbook for a career in wildlife management and natural resource conservation. What this book contains are what I consider to be the 20 life lessons that I considered invaluable to doing projects, developing projects, and making them successful based on my 50 years of experience. Earlier in the book, it has education strategies for high school and university students as they plan their curriculum, but it also has on-the-job strategies for innovative project development and project management that many of you might find useful throughout any point in your whole career. And that's available online right now through Amazon.com. Another thing is that what I did in that book is to identify those 20 life lessons that I felt were invaluable during my career. One of them, number 2, in choosing a grad school, if you want to be the best, learn from the best. Learn from the ones who wrote the book. This is Dr. Dan Jansen on the left and Eugene Odom, Dr. Eugene Odom from the University of Georgia, head of their Institute of Ecology. They were both recipients of the Crawford Prize, biologist equivalent of the Nobel Prize, and I had the privilege of having studied under both of them while I was in Georgia and also with the Organization for Tropical Studies in Costa Rica. My career actually started with in Minnesota in 1974, and this is what I had always wanted. And my life lesson number 1, follow your passion, study what you love, and love what you do. That is where you will find success. And then that's tied in closely to life lesson number 6. In picking your job, don't follow the dollars, follow your heart. In 1974, I left an environmental consultant job paying $15,000 per year for a DNR assistant game manager job paying $10,000 per year. It was the right choice. And then 3 years later, a new position was created in the Minnesota DNR. It was March 1977, and I was selected to be the new non-game wildlife program supervisor for the DNR. First time that position had ever been offered, first time they had ever stepped beyond the realm of game management. And so 1977 was really the year that I saw a transition in emphasis from game management in my own life and in many things in the DNR to non-game wildlife conservation. 1977 was a challenging year because even though I was in charge of a statewide program, I was in charge of no one, and my budget was somewhere between $25,000 and $30,000 per year, but it wasn't even a line item in the DNR budget. And half of that was my salary. So without much of a salary and with no staff, I spent much of 1977 listening. I spent the year traveling throughout Minnesota, consulting with wildlife managers, federal wildlife refuge managers, university professors, and citizen conservationists to listen to them about what were their priorities for addressing the needs of non-game wildlife. These are some of the people I talked to: Dr. Walter Breckenridge, Pat Reddig, Harrison Tordoff. And since I was on a low budget, I've used initial projects that were citizen science mail surveys. People reported nesting loons, heron colonies, bald eagle nests, and sandhill crane nesting sites by mail. So I was able to build a database in those first couple of years with virtually no budget and no people. So I had many observers, from 200 to over 500 just alone for the loon survey, and it gave me some great data from those initial mail surveys. And then I picked a low budget project. I fundraised for $150 per otter. There were no otters in southwestern Minnesota. They had been totally extirpated. And I was in charge of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species for Minnesota. And I had to report on what was happening with otters, lynx, and bobcats to the federal government. And when there were no otters to be found, I put together a proposal to say, well, we should capture some in northern Minnesota and release them on the Minnesota River. And it went through. And I got all of the local wildlife and statewide wildlife managers to agree on this. And we did releases both on the Lac-qui-Parle Wildlife Refuge and Big Stone National Wildlife Refuge. The otters were caught by volunteer otter trappers in northern Minnesota in small mink traps that didn't hurt their feet. And then they were flown down to the Lac-qui-Parle Refuge. And in total, over our 2 years, 1979 and 80, we captured 22 otters and released them in southwest Minnesota. All the money was donated. It was $5,000. And the otters are now all the way from the South Dakota border all the way down to Mankato. And otter releases in Iowa have spread northward, so that whole area of southern Minnesota has otters once again. And then something miraculous happened in 1980. State Senator Colin Peterson introduced a non-game wildlife checkoff bill patterned after one that was already passed in Colorado. And it made it possible for people to donate money to help protected wildlife like eagles and loons and swans and other wildlife like butterflies. And it gave me a whole new change of perspective, because now from going to from a $30,000 per year budget, the money came in and became available for spending in 1982, over $500,000. Just like I had just died and gone to heaven, I had possibilities for all kinds of wonderful work. Now, this is our original non-game staff. I hired 5 regional non-game specialists, and 3 of them were women. And I hired some of the best people I could find. Joan Galley from New Jersey, Katie Hawes, Minnesota, Pam Perry, originally from Minnesota. She had worked in Florida, and Katie had worked in Alaska and Washington State. They had a lot of experience, but these were the very first women ever hired in the section of wildlife in the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. It was totally unheard of. And now here's a picture that I took in 2015 of our non-game staff. We had 20 people and 14 were women. So this was a major, major change in the opportunities for employment for people who formerly had never considered this a career opportunity. This is Katie and Pam when they received their 30-year awards. between the three of them, including Joan Galley, together they served for me for 90 total cumulative years. They each did about 30 years of service in the positions where they found non-game wildlife a most fulfilling opportunity. Now, here's another thing that happened. I was currently the president of the Non-Game Wildlife Association of North America at that time in the late 90s, early 80s. And I was in demand as a speaker for the keynote addresses to start new non-game wildlife programs. So I gave programs for North Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Iowa, Illinois, Michigan, Alaska, also Virginia and Florida, to help them learn, first of all, how to include non-game wildlife programs design and implementation, but also how to promote their new checkoffs on the state tax form, because many of those people were not acquainted with the efforts to use the media to promote wildlife conservation. These are some of the chapters in the upcoming book that will be published this fall, Bald Eagle Recovery. This is an article that I read in 1977, the first documentation of an eagle dying from lead poisoning after eating Canada geese that contained lead shot. When I worked at Lac du Parle, the bald eagles that wintered there also fed on Canada geese. And I thought, oh, this is the same situation that was reported in that article. So I had picked up this eagle as a dying eagle in November of 1974. It had droopy wings. I walked right up to it and picked it up. And it had all the indications that I later found were characteristic of lead poisoning. The bird had died by the next morning, and I was unable to get it to the Raptor Center, but it was too far gone for saving. And the bird is now, I was a licensed taxidermist at the time, so I mounted the bird, with the appropriate permits, and then it's in the St. Paul office at the Department of Natural Resources now. But one of the sad things about what we found was that lead shotgun pellets are forever toxins that do not degrade after they are shot. And we had no money in the non-game program available at the time, or in the section of wildlife at the point that before the checkoff came along. And we called the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Laurel, Maryland, and asked if they had funding to research this problem, because if bald eagles were being poisoned by the use of lead shot, this would be a major problem, because the eagle at that time was federally threatened. So we got Steve Hennis, a grad student from the University of Minnesota, to take on this project to study the problem of whether or not eagles were being poisoned at Lac du Parle. We got Gary Duke and Pat Reddig involved with this project. They were absolutely wonderful to work with, and they were wonderful mentors as well for me to work with. And that's another one of those life lessons waiting to be discovered. Find the mentors in your midst who will share their vision, perspective, and lifelong passion for nature. It's a lifelong opportunity to improve your own passion for your own career. Well, the solution to all of these problems is the use of steel shot. By 1987, Minnesota was requiring steel shot for all waterfowl hunting in Minnesota. Unfortunately, toxic lead shot is still used for upland hunting for pheasants and grouse and rabbits, and it's also lead used in deer hunting. And there are over 500,000 deer hunters in Minnesota. They take about 170,000 deer per year, and a large proportion of those people don't see the need for changing to steel because they don't see the impact of what it does to our eagles. Now, another thing that happened in my early years with eagle conservation is that many of the eastern states had only 1 or 2 eagle pairs still nesting, and in some states they were already extirpated. They wanted to reintroduce eagles. And so I set up a program whereby we would donate 5 eagles per year, eagle chicks, to these states. And we did this for 11 years. And here we are in northern Minnesota. This is an eagle chick that jumped from its nest when our climber got to the top of the tree, and it sailed down and landed on this perch. And I was with my son Craig. And another life lesson here, keep a healthy balance between your professional and personal life. I took Craig with because I wanted him to see what his dad was doing to help Minnesota's wildlife. Well, over those 11 years, these are the states that we helped to restore eagles with. Uh, New York got 8 chicks, Missouri 15, Tennessee 14, Georgia 15, Arkansas 3. And there have been restoration programs with eagles also donated from several other states, but these have been very successful and the eagles are making a very beautiful recovery. However, we still have a problem with eagles being poisoned from deer hunters who apparently don't care because they say they don't see the eagles dying. But the Minnesota Raptor Center gets probably about 30 eagles per year that have been lead poisoned. Some of these are lead poison but from eating deer gut piles. Other times they find deer that hunters have not retrieved and they forage on those and get exposed to the lead as well. We worked with the Wildlife Society sponsoring shooting clinics that compared lead and copper ammo performance for hunters where they could use their own shotgun or rifle and try out the ammo. And you can see on the left here, this is a fragmented lead bullet that exploded when it hit its target. All those little pieces there are little pieces of lead that go into the venison and into the deer gut pile. On the right is an intact copper bullet. It's non-toxic, it does not shatter, and it does not poison anything. It's non-toxic. These are the tiny bullet fragments that go into the venison, where if someone goes deer hunting, brings home venison and feeds it to their spouse and their kids, this is the lead that's embedded in that venison. That venison should not be consumed. The Minnesota Department of Agriculture tests venison donated to food shelves every year, and the average has been about 9% of all the venison packages coming from those venison donated packages contain lead. And they destroy all those packages, but it means that everybody who goes home and keeps their own venison and feeds it to their family is feeding lead to their family. I wouldn't even feed that to the dog. This is a non-toxic copper billet. There's no fragmentation, no lead poisoning. They're very accurate and they're just as effective or more effective than lead ammo ever was. Now, another key issue in major conservation efforts is picking your project partners. Now, your project partners will often be different from one project to the other. In this case, we work with Isaac Walton, the Pollution Control Agency, the Wildlife Society, University of Minnesota Raptor Center, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Conservation Federation. All of these people had their own networks by which they could spread the word and help get an adaptation to use of non-toxic ammo. Peregrine falcon restoration was another early priority. This was in 1983. Dr. Pat Reddy and I flew to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan to pick up peregrine chicks that we were going to be releasing in Minnesota. And so we picked up the 15 chicks that had been hatched and raised by Dr. Lynn Oliphant from the University of Saskatchewan. We got the birds back, they were banded and then released. And this is one of the first chick to be released atop the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And now the birds are successfully nesting in that area as well. There's one of those chicks ready for putting into the hack tower. And now 40 plus years later, this was our result from last summer. We had 48 successful nesting sites, and those birds fledged 143 young this past year. And they're nesting throughout all of the places that peregrines originally nested, and now they're on many artificial domestic sites as well, corporate sites and smokestacks. We also have a webcam for peregrine watching right in downtown St. Paul, Minnesota. People can just tune in and watch the birds nesting and raising their young every spring. Trumpeter swans, another priority, big priority for Minnesota. They were extirpated by 1884. Three Rivers Parks District began local reintroduction in 1966, and they have locally brought back trumpeters in the Western metro area. But we wanted to expand that restoration beyond the metro area to the statewide. Dr. Jim Cooper and I wrote up a proposal for restoration that, with the plan implemented in 1982. This involved collecting 50 trumpeter swan eggs per year in 1986, 87, and 88 in central Alaska at the Minto Flats. We had a hatching rate of 86% those 3 years. And each year, Dave Algren, a citizen volunteer, and I made the trip to collect 50 eggs per year. We used a float plane furnished by Rod King and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We flew into lakes that Rod had already located, collected. There were usually 5 or 6 eggs in the nest. We would leave 2 live eggs and then take the balance for a return back to Minnesota. These eggs are different in color. Some lakes have more iron than others, so they're a darker color than eggs from other lakes. We got the eggs back to Minnesota and used the old game farm incubators for hatching the trumpeter swans. It's Steve Kettleson, our biologist. And then I was at a point where when we were approaching our 2nd year of raising the birds in captivity, we needed to transport them to northwestern Minnesota for release. But if we put them in 2.5-ton trucks bouncing around, it was going to potentially damage their legs. They could have lifelong injuries from the transit. I felt we needed a plane. Well, I had served in the Air Force as a captain after I got out of graduate school. And I was in the Military Airlift Command, so I was familiar with the capabilities of the C-130 transport planes. So I called the Minnesota Air National Guard and said, would you be interested in doing a training flight to carry 40 trumpeter swans from the Twin Cities up to northwest Minnesota so we could release these swans without injuring them? And they were kind of surprised by that request, since I wasn't even in the Air Force at the time. They said, well, we'll check into it, see what they think. Well, I got a call back a couple of days later, and they said, yeah, we're a go. So at that point, I called ABC News, NBC, and CBS in New York City, their news assignment desks. And I said, we're going to make the biggest release of 40 trumpeter swans in the history of the United States. Are you interested in covering that story? And they sent Roger Harris out for 3 days to cover that story. And it was heard and seen by over probably 30 million people in that spring of 1988. And it was just amazing to see that response. And he was very emphatic in his coverage that this was a gift that Minnesotans gave to themselves by donating on the tax form, because that was where the money came from to make that release possible. So here we are loading up the C-130 for our trumpeter swan flight to northwest Minnesota. This was the trumpeter swan's first official flight. We continued those releases for 3 years, and then we also received many trumpeter swans raised at about 6 zoos throughout the country, including mainly the Minnesota Zoo in Apple Valley. They were a major contributor to help add to the number of birds that came from Alaska. And another life lesson here. Most important wildlife restoration projects require not just years, but decades to accomplish. This is where you need the patience, determination, and sometimes the stubbornness to keep working on what you're working on and not give up. In all, our trumpeter swan project cost just over $500,000 over 20 years. We released 372 swans. And now, incredibly, the current population was estimated a couple of years ago at about 50,000. So it's probably over 60,000 swans across Minnesota now. They're nesting in 80 out of 87 counties in Minnesota. This is their distribution map for swans, but this is outdated. This is from 2015. That would be a much more densely dotted map now if we had one available. And again, project partners were key to the success of this whole project. the DNR non-game program staff, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Forest Service, White Earth Indian Band, Three Rivers Parks, the Trumpeters Home Society, and the Delwood Foundation. All were critical to the long-term success of this effort. Loon, another featured bird, since it's our state bird in Minnesota. One of our biggest shocks during my service in the DNR was when the Deepwater Horizon oil spill occurred in the Gulf of Mexico. Minnesota had loons that were wintering in the Gulf of Mexico at the time. And it was in an area where potentially there would have been loons wintering. So I put together a proposal with a couple of my other compatriots back at the DNR to study the potential impact of loons from the oil spill. And we proposed this for use of state lottery money, the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund for loon research. The grand total was $641,000 they awarded for study of the impact of the oil spill on loons. And this is Kevin Keno from the U.S. Geological Survey. He was instrumental and a key person who made everything happen in terms of the technology we needed to do that study. This is a techie loon here. It's equipped with a satellite antenna and has an internal transmitter that allows us to follow them anywhere on Earth, mainly in the Gulf of Mexico. We were able to document the migratory routes of the loons and find that their wintering sites, which were right in the area contaminated by the pollution from the BP spill. At the conclusion of the assessments being done, we were awarded $7.7 million from the BP people for loon recovery in Minnesota to help restore loons that were killed by the oil spill. This also included $1.2 million for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency for Get the Lead Out tackle exchanges to reduce the amount of lead poisoning occurring in Minnesota loons. And it doesn't take much lead to kill a loon. This is the gizzard content from a loon that died of lead poisoning that had just one lead sinker, and that's what killed it. So we still need a lot of work done, and we appreciate the efforts by the Pollution Control Agency to reduce the use of lead jigs and sinkers for fishing, because more and more non-toxic jigs and sinkers are becoming available, and we need to promote that to keep not only our loons, but also our trumpeter swans from being poisoned. All it takes is a single lead pellet to kill a loon. And again, I mentioned the Pollution Control Agency got $1.2 million for non-toxic tackle exchanges. And they also received $1 million a year ago from the Minnesota legislature for promoting protection of our Minnesota loons. And now we're coming to the part you've all been waiting patiently for: monarchs, purple martins, eastern bluebirds, backyard wildlife. One of my early books, 1987, was Landscaping for Wildlife. There are 8 habitat components I identified for landscaping, plant components, and then 8 structural components. 2 of the most important ones that are butterfly, bee, and moth plants and hummingbird plants. And that's a part of the content of my early landscaping book. Now, life lesson number 16, always have a pet project, something you really care about, you enjoy. Now, this was when we first moved into Blaine, when I first got hired by the DNR. This was our backyard. And you can see one tiny little spruce tree between my son Craig and myself. And that was in 1977. This is the same view into our backyard in 1992. So again, you have to be patient, but we did a little bit every year. And the response we had by pollinators, butterflies, moths, wonderful creatures was quite remarkable. And this is the deck that we built onto the backside of our house. And this is my wife Ethel in her backyard garden. And we had a lot to enjoy, and it has provided us with many hours of enjoyment every year with our increasing knowledge and use of pollinators, like the monarch, bumblebees, and attracting hummingbirds as well. I did several books for the DNR. This is Woodworking for Wildlife. Over the years, it sold over 97,000 copies. It has information on bluebird houses, wood duck houses. And then I needed to change the gist of our landscaping for wildlife book to help lakeshore owners, because there are many people who buy a lakeshore lot and then they proceed to destroy all the native vegetation in the lot right down to the water's edge. They put in bluegrass lawns and riprap on the shore, destroying any habitat. And then they go out when nobody's looking and they rip out all of the emergent vegetation in front of their house too. This sold 26,000
This
copies.
buffer zone of land and water plants should include at least 75% of your
Just a
shoreline
minute
front.
here. So anyway, the lakescaping book has been a big help to help promote this. And now you can go to the DNR site, website, and the book has been transcribed onto the website called Restore Your Shore. You can go to that and it will give you native plants available for lakeshore landscaping. So Restore Your Shore, Minnesota DNR website. The next project we did was the digital bridge to nature workshops for teachers. Life lesson number 13, use the multiplier effect to spread conservation messages. It's an important recruitment tool for the next generation of conservationists. To get this project underway, we hired Dudley Edmondson, photographer and author of Black and Brown Faces and America's Wild Places. We involved White Earth Indian Band, East Lake Indian Magnet School, and Wyndham Spanish Dual Immersion School. And then to kick off the whole project, we got Jim Brandenburg, internationally known National Geographic photographer, to give the keynote address in his hometown of Laverne, Minnesota. And we took about 60 to 70 school teachers out that day onto the prairie that he had helped acquire for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And everybody got practice taking pictures of flowers, pollinators, and got kids really excited. Over 3 years, we had 76 teacher workshops and about 1,100 teacher participants. They reached 66,000 students in 3 years. And again, all of the work that's happening and still continues to happen comes from the loan on the tax forms. The non-game wildlife checkoff has raised over $50 million for Minnesota wildlife since 1982. Every dollar donated to the non-game fund is also matched by $2 from the sale of critical habitat license plates. So it's a 2-to-1 match. And these are some of the plates available, and all of the plates are used for that state match every year. And just to wrap things up here, this is your conservation playbook. This is something where you can find those life lessons and how they can help benefit your work ethic, your strategies for building a program. And this is the book that will be out in October this year, A National Legacy, 50 Years of Non-Game Wildlife Conservation, 1974 to 2024. This is putting all of that information I have covered very briefly into more detail, and there are many other projects that were not even covered in today's presentation. But this is wrapping up I guess you could say this is my 50 years and 50 minutes summary of how to benefit wildlife in your own state, no matter where you're from, Canada, United States, throughout the United States. All of us have an opportunity to make a difference. And whether we work with the DNR, private organizations, or just in our own backyard, this is a chance to enhance the survival of the creatures, the pollinators we all care about. Thank you.